Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Archetypal Radio. I'm Michael Ebbinghaus. Today on the show, we have our inaugural guest. I'm very excited to introduce her. Her name is Ally Lyons. She is someone that I met a few months ago, and I was very impressed by the openness of her spirit and the radiance of her heart. She was a very easy person to approach and get to know and to whom I feel like we could reveal our real selves quite quickly. And it was a pleasure to sit with her then. It was a massive pleasure to interview her this evening. She was an absolutely radiant guest. And Ally and I discuss her journey towards inner guidance and what that has meant for her, how she first came into contact with it, how it was very intuitive at first, how this thread continued to thicken, how it changed her relationship to herself and to the world, and how it's brought a lot of ease and grace into her life. And so right now she is currently living on the East Coast. She has supported change-making entrepreneurs with operations, project management, and event management for over 10 years. She began practicing yoga and meditation about 9 years ago with a pull to calm her mind, which she views as the gateway into her spiritual rabbit hole of bliss. And as she's continued to listen, she was called to become a yoga teacher and has since become a certified reiki practitioner, working with energy of the body and the universe, and an MVT 109 facilitator. It is my pleasure to introduce Ally this evening. And without further ado, I give you Ally Lyons. So Ally, yeah, I would just want to get clear on when did you first start to come into contact with what you would call your inner guidance? Or maybe we can start there. What is your source of inner guidance? How do you define it? What do you call it?
Yeah, so when I think of like inner guidance, it's like this like a deep full body knowing. And it's like you almost, at least in the beginning, like couldn't explain it, but it's like it's almost like your body is like telling you like, hey, pay attention, or like this message needs to come through. And then in regards to like first, you said like when's the first time I like kind of like noticed it or started to become
Mm-hmm.
aware of it? Honestly, so I was like reflecting on this actually like a couple months ago, and I was thinking about I used to have, or I still do have, a very strong intuition, but even when I was a little kid, I would have really strong knowings. That's the only way I could really explain
Mm-hmm.
it, about like someone or something I wanted to do, or like a situation. And I could never explain it. I couldn't be like, oh, here's the rational side of that or the logic brain side of that. It was just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I know that this is like this. And someone might be like, well, why? And I'm like, I don't know. It just is. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like I couldn't explain it. And then as I got older, I started to like understand it a bit more, especially as I got more into like my own spiritual practices and energy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it was a knowing, and it would manifest in your body or in an intention. What would that look like?
You mean like in the physical body? Like what would that look or feel like?
Yeah, what did it feel like in your body? What sort of things did it incline you to do? What sort of people did it incline you to do? What did it call you
Okay.
to?
Okay, so like first examples, when I was younger, I had like, I don't want to say an obsession, but again, like this knowing of like, oh, I grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I was always like, oh, I need to go to Los Angeles, and I don't know why. And it wasn't like I had, oh, I want to be in the entertainment world or I care about celebrities. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't anything like that. It was like, I have a knowing that like Los Angeles is calling me. I did a project on it when I was in fourth grade, and it was like, why? Don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have any family from California, never visited, and it wasn't until I got older and I had enough money to like get a plane ticket and go, that I was like, I know I have to go to Southern California. I need to go to LA and I
Mm-hmm.
need to check it out. And upon getting there, again, still not knowing why, I like step off the plane. I'm like, oh, I feel like a sense of home, like almost like I belong here. And
Mm-hmm.
then I came back, I'd visit all the time and I'd keep visiting more and more over the years. And then eventually one day my sister was like, hey, I'm thinking about moving to LA and doing like an internship there out of college. I don't want to go by myself. Will you come with me? And it's almost like I don't want to say like blackout, but you're like, oh, you lose like full consciousness. And I'm just like, of course. And like within a month, I'm packing up and driving to LA, and I moved to LA and lived there for a year. And like what came of that, of like connections and new friends and new clients, and just like what trickled from that in my life is like an example of, it's like, oh, this like deep knowing that I knew I was supposed to go there, and I knew it wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
permanent thing, but I knew I needed to go, and I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
explain why. So that's just like one example, but that
Mm-hmm.
similar things like that have shown up in my life, like booking a one-way ticket to Hawaii, and I was supposed to go visit my best friends for like 2 weeks, and I ended up staying there for like 2.5 months. And it was like the most healing experience of my
Mm-hmm.
life. Like I knew I had to stay there, and I didn't know why. And it was like I almost come to this like completion feeling of like, okay, my time or energy here is complete, and I got what I needed to out of this, and then I like move on to something else.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so what I'm getting from that is that there's like this there's almost like this trans-temporal nature to it. It's like there's something that is reaching to you beyond like what you could know at the time.
Yeah.
And there's an uncertainty, but you just have this yearning or this pull to go. And then you abide by that, and then you meet the people, you go to the places that bring you healing, that bring you further into your own, selfness and power
Yeah, there's
and
all these like ripple effects that happen from whatever that knowing was, that I was like, I don't know why I'm following this, but
Mhm.
and if I
Right, and
ignore
nor
it,
could
it
you,
gets
right?
very loud.
Mm. So
It's
it
very loud.
intensifies. Okay,
Yes.
how does it get loud?
So an example, so I was like going back and forth about like, oh, maybe I should go visit my best friend in Hawaii. This was like many years ago. And I was like, okay, like I should like look at tickets, don't end up buying it, and I just leave it alone. And then it's like Hawaii will throw itself in my face. Pineapples are appearing everywhere. Like all these different things will start getting really, really loud. And I forget the specifics of it, but it was like something ended up turning out, like I travel quite a bit, like going to events for like work and stuff, and something ended up linking up perfectly where like we went to go do a site visit for something in Hawaii, and it was like perfectly linked up with when I kept saying I was going to go. And I was like, at that point
Mm.
it's like I'm going to Hawaii, even though I didn't even like, I know I want to go and I know I need to go, but I just never pulled the trigger on it. And then it's like life kind of like pulled the trigger for me and was like, oh, you're going. And then I ended up
Mm.
staying there so long.
So events even outside of your control, yeah, gotcha. So the whole kind of container of life will
Mm.
mold itself to where you are propelled towards that path. May I ask what it was about that experience in Hawaii that was so healing? Or were there different like episodes or
It was
sensations that
definitely
you
a,
had?
yeah, it was definitely a combination of definitely nature for sure, like just the elements of being in Hawaii. Like it was so different from obviously being from like the East Coast and like that vibe for sure. But it was like somehow the way my days were structured, it was just like completely different than my regular routine. And it wasn't even like, I don't even remember being like intentional about it and being like, hey, this is how my days are going to go while I'm here. Like it was just like an automatic, like plane landed, this is how my days are going to go. And it's happening this way. And I would kind of just like flow. It felt very like flowy, almost like it was like you were moving with the energy of like
Mm-hmm.
the area you were in. So like being on one of the islands in Hawaii, it was like my days felt flowy. My work that I was doing every day felt flowy, like exploring different parts of the island. Like even my best friend that I was staying with and her roommate that were there, it was like we got into this like like transformational type of like daily routine. Like we'd read together. Like I randomly was gifted a book that I just started as
Mm-hmm.
I got there, and so the three of us would read it together every single night. And none of this was like, oh, this is what we're doing. It was just like kind of just happening almost. It was a very interesting trip for sure.
Just fell together. Beautiful. And so when did you really start to recognize this like kind of felt sense or intuition and as a source of inner guidance? And how did your life start to shift once you really started to, it sounds like you also just kind of like really leaned into it intuitively as well and went where it compelled you to go. And but how has it changed you, or what has come of it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So it's like I've always had this like sense of like deep gut feelings and intuition, and it's gotten louder as I've gotten older for sure. And the polar opposite of that of like, oh, just following your knowing without seeing the path or seeing why or seeing the logicness of it or the future of it is I also used to struggle with like the need to control everything. Is I used to call myself a control freak. And then those two things don't flow well together. It's like you
Hmm.
can't be controlling everything around you if you're trying to listen to this deep knowing that is literally just like energy or a spirit guiding you somewhere and you don't know where that's going to go. So it was almost like me learning to surrender to be met with less resistance in my life because I noticed that like I would start to be met with a lot of resistance both internally and externally, so that would create in the form of anxiety or anger or my health. And
Hmm.
the more I surrendered and just like listened to that knowing with things, the more ease I had in my life. And then that would trickle through different parts, whether that be in relationships or health or almost this sense of like things just like almost like falling in your lap because of your like this sense of surrender almost. I
Hmm.
don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely, it does. And you mentioned that you have different practices and now like tuning into energy and different things. So have you found any ways, or anything that you do, whether it's practices, whether it's streams, whatever it might be, that really strengthen that connection or that makes you more available to listen to it?
Mm, yeah, so definitely like meditation for sure, connecting with the elements in nature, using that as like a presence practice, like the more grounded I can be, because I notice if I'm not doing grounding, and by that I mean like literally going out in the sunlight or going and putting your feet in the earth. Um, when I don't do that consistently, I start to get very like not flighty, but it's like I'm not as easily like, oh yeah, okay, this is my knowing, and like I can feel this very strongly. Like it's kind of gets all over the place, almost like there's like clouds everywhere in your mind or body or something. So I'd definitely say like grounding for sure. I've gotten very intentional about my mornings. So I noticed that if I don't spend like, oh, like think of it as like a sacred morning space of like, hey, how do I like ease into waking up? Because the other part of that is I like have very vivid dreams, which I think we talked about before.
Mhm.
And it's like, how do I have to literally like move out of the, okay, I'm coming out of vivid dream space because I've dreamt every night my whole life that I can remember. And then it's like this transition into like, okay, I'm awake now. And then like, how's my day going to move? Because I've noticed if I just jump into things without using this like sacred quiet time, then again, I'm met with all this like it could show up as anxiety or agitation, or I get snippy, or I'm not able to hear that inner voice as much. I'm not as connected to energy or the spirit or the universe.
Mhm. And so it's more of a
Yoga would be another thing too. Like I do yoga every single day and that definitely helps because it's like moving the energy,
mhm,
uses a lot of breath work, uses meditation. So like those types of practices, the more consistent I am with them, the more tapped in I am, I guess you could say.
mhm. So it sounds like there's like a mixture of like interacting with all of the different parts of the different parts of yourself, your body, your connection to the earth, to this realm of time and space, and even to the, a causal and, the dream world. And that sacred space or that sacred morning makes it to where you're less, it's not even necessarily that you're like less in the ego, but like that you're more in every other part of you as
Mm,
well. And so it's like it's
yeah.
still, that's that part of you is still there. The ego is still there, but it can kind of relax a little bit as you're bringing all these different parts and attentions to yourself. These broader kind of expanded states of
Mm,
mind.
yeah.
Mhm. And so, does it do you view dreams as a source of guidance? Do you feel like they compel you towards anything, or do they show you anything about you?
So I've gone back and forth in the like my feel and opinion around dreams because of how vivid or like even like nightmare type dreams versus like, oh, is it stuff that was like subconsciously infiltrated during my day, then showing up at my night? However, I recently, while doing Reiki training, met this woman who was sharing with me like someone who has vivid dreams consistently every single night. She believes that like in the culture that she comes from, that they're basically messages coming in and they're
Hmm.
not necessarily connected to you, and that it could be literally messages that are like to help save someone else or to help guide someone else. And it could be something that is sent to you in a year. It could be a dream you had 5 years ago. And so she started encouraging me to have a dream journal, which I haven't done since I was like a little kid. And that was more like, oh, I was doing it for fun. And she was like, even if you just remember words or feelings or places you were, just write them down because you never know. Like you could literally meet someone that like, oh, something showed up in your dream that's going to like help them in some way. And so now I'm kind of taking it a little more serious.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've noticed in my own experience that they'll come back up like whenever you need them to. Like you'll just
Mm,
have like a random association to like, oh man, I haven't thought about this stream, or like I totally forgot about this stream, and now I'm all of a sudden back in that space and I have no idea why. So it's kind of
mm.
weird with those weird uncanny connections behind the screen. Yeah. So how is tuning into your inner guidance, how has moving along the path that you've journeyed, how has that really influenced your view of the world and how you connect to it?
It's definitely shifted more of my view in regards to like, hey, what's meant for me will present itself to me, and a really release of that control. And like, oh, when I it comes to making decisions or it comes to a relationship or something like that, it's like trusting that my inner knowing will guide me in the right direction, and not like you have that sense people talk about of like, oh, should I do this or should I do that? And I don't really get that anymore, that
Hmm.
indecision whatsoever. And I used to like question, like, oh, like people talk about, oh, my head is saying do this and my heart's saying do this, or like my body's saying this, but my mind is saying this. And I don't really have that toddle back and forth anymore. It's more like merged, almost like we were talking about earlier. Is like, how would you like
Mm,
merge those two? And so now it's more of like this deep inner trusting that I wouldn't even say is like separate from mind and body, but really just like, oh, that's me. And like I have a deep sense of trust and knowing in myself to then be able to make decisions like that.
mhm. Yeah, that's really beautiful because that hits on a point that I think is so crucial to this whole journey, and to that idea is that idea of connecting to something beyond yourself that you are so intimately connected to in weird ways that defy
Mm,
explanation. But then as you continue to follow it and see what happens as a result, that it's like, oh wow, yeah, that is how it is. You can't
mm,
not be connected in this
right.
way. And so yeah, and what you're pointing to is that it really brings about like a really wonderful integration of
Mm,
this split that so many of us often experience with regards to what are we doing here, what are we doing with our lives, where does our dissatisfaction stem from?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A big thing I think to that point is like, oh, it created a lot more ease in my life, a lot more flow in my life. Like it definitely like completely subsided any type of like anxiety that I was used to having most of my life, because it's just like, oh, now I have this like inner knowing that I really trust. And of just like a few examples. So like I was brought on a new client last fall, and I couldn't explain why, but I was so drawn to her. And I was like, I know that I need to work with this person. And like, if we're meant to work together, great. And we did. And I knew it wasn't going to be that long term of a thing, but I knew there was a reason for that. And lo and behold, like it opened me up to a whole other part of like energy work that I subconsciously clearly was interested in and wanted to know. And it kind of like has guided me through. I always call it like the ripple effects of like just one
Mm,
connection or like one event. And it's like you don't know what large ripple effect could come from that. So having this like inner guide or knowing to like, oh, I should work with this person, can't explain why. Like on paper, I'm not sure if it matches up, but like I know deep in my soul that like, oh, I'm supposed to work with this person for a little bit. And then it's
mhm,
like what happened from that. Another example, like me and my partner is we were friends. We met in person going to the same event on a plane, and he was about to get married and I was in a long-term relationship with someone else, and we both sat down on that plane next to each other, and we talk about it now. It's like I had this like literally I sat down and I was like, I think I'm sitting next to my soulmate, and I like couldn't explain why. And I was like, this is so weird. And I was like, this doesn't make any
mm,
sense. Like I'm in a really like happy relationship where like we loved each other. He was in a happy relationship. He was about to get married. And I was like, oh, like soulmates can be friends. Like maybe that's what it is. Like I really believe it's like we have all different versions of soulmates all around us. And then it's like now we're together, and just the way those things, the way like life happened and just matched it up. There was no forcing. There was no like, oh, we need to be together. It just like
mm,
happened. And it's very interesting to notice and think back to that like moment on a plane where like I had a full body reaction of like, oh no, you're sitting next to like your soulmate. And I was like, this is so crazy to think about.
mhm,
But looking at it like, oh, I'm going to accept this feeling and knowing without attachment or without force. And you're not going to force something to happen. You just know, oh, this is the way it's meant to happen.
mhm. Yeah, because how much in the end do we really know? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And that's the beauty about following these things, I think, is that we can conceptualize to whatever degree based on our body and on what we think we want and what the values that we've been raised in, steeped in, whatever. But when we're all doing that, and there's so many of us now, we're kind of going in all of these different directions. And what I think is really interesting is, one, it seems like in the individual, like within your own experience, it sounds like all of these kind of various like dualities, conflicts within you started to resolve, and you could just be alive with the mystery in a way, and
Mm,
like you're saying, like flow through everything and not really know exactly what's going on, but just
right. Like being okay to sit in the unknown and trusting anyway.
exactly. And I think that that not only happens like within an individual, but the more people that are listening to that, then we can do that as societies, as communities. And
Mm,
when everyone is it's one of those things. It feels like sometimes there's like a sacrifice that has to happen, and there is a sacrifice that has to happen. You have to be able to give up your own sense of security and
that
certainty,
need to control.
need to control. um but then it's like that total self-surrender leads you into this place of just absolute, it's not always majestic, right? It can be, and I would love to hear if you had any experiences where it wasn't so majestic, because we can get caught up in the like, oh, I had this effervescent experience, and like I followed my intuition and I found myself in Hawaii near a waterfall and my heart broke open, and all of these things. But it feels like, to that extent, that once you let go, it also like fully embraces the particulars of who you are. You're not erased in any way. In fact, every piece of you gets like elevated and polished and brightened, and can really shine forth through all of that.
Mm.
um so yeah, I was wondering if you can speak to that. Like, how have you seen like the better aspects of yourself, or the not even the better aspects, but have you seen like that need to control, that kind of shadow side of you, like be given over to and put forth or put towards the goal that you're aiming towards?
I definitely feel like when I think about it, is like I still have parts of that come up because at the end of the day, it's like we always still have this like shadow self of us in there. And I was like actually reflecting on it a bit recently because I had a feeling like that come up again where it was like, oh, this, like, I call it like ants crawling under your skin. It's like this itch, you don't
Mm,
know where it is, or like an agitation or a little angry. And it comes from this sense of like anxiety or need to control or like not knowing, and just sitting in that anyway. But it was definitely a process, like, over the last several years of like getting deeper into like this trusting and knowing. And it was met with a lot of like resistance back and forth. Like, I literally felt like there was like,
mhm,
I used to tell actually one of my friends maybe like 2 years ago, it felt like there were like two me's fighting almost. And it was like, oh, this one side is like flowy and very intuitive and like knows to just trust the knowing. And then the other one is like, well, no, like, take control of the situation, like, plan this, do this, like, you're in charge of la la la. And it's like dealing with those two, or I guess working through those two pieces
mhm,
of yourself. And they've definitely merged a lot more, and I've been able for them to like dance a little bit better now. But it's definitely like the control side of that, the shadow side of that has started to like decrease as I've noticed what sense of ease comes with this like trusting and knowing. And I think a lot of it too is
mhm,
like because of the society we're in, or like the type of world we live in, is like everyone tries to move to, or a lot of people try to move into that logic of like, oh, okay, well, look, why are you doing this, or like what's the reasoning behind it. And I got okay with being like, I don't have a reason, or I don't know, and being okay
mhm.
with that.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from that is beautiful and fascinating, and it's that like need to control, or like whatever security came from that need to control just eased into that feeling of inner knowing,
Mm,
and through letting go, and like through the dance that happens through those two sides of yourself, that need to control side of yourself actually was, brought in and integrated, and it was like, oh, that's right, I can just
mm,
let go, and it's all good.
right. And I will
Mm,
say I did do 1 year. So like every year I pick a word of like, oh, this is my theme for the year. And 1 year, my word a couple years ago, it was surrender. And I was like, even had resistance to making that word
mhm,
my word for the year. And I was like, that's how you know it's the right word.
right,
So it was like I had this constant reminder. I would write it everywhere. I would reflect on it, like when I journal. I'd literally put sticky notes places when things would come up. I'd be like, okay, how can I surrender in this moment? Like, what does that mean? And a lot of it was shadow stuff coming up and realizing that I was associating surrender with weakness or like
mhm,
submissiveness. And I was like, oh, that's not what it has to be at all. And I had to like reframe what
mhm.
surrender meant for me. And it was a very big year in that. And I think through that year and through choosing that word, it helped that merging happen of like
Mhm.
releasing that control for sure.
Yeah, there's a really beautiful thing to be said about like the difference between submission and surrender. And I think that part of it is like submission is like you're bent in a way, and
Mm,
surrender is just a total like openness.
right. You're just like
Mhm,
flowy and like, here we are.
yeah. May I ask is your word this year?
My word this year. So I cheated and I have two. Normally I only have one, but it's nourishment and expansion.
Mm.
And
Oh,
expansion has already been throwing itself at me. I just had like a psychic reading yesterday, and like the first word she said is like, you need to focus on expansion this year. Like that, it's going to be an extremely expansive year for you. And I was like, I know.
I love that. How is that showing up for you right now, and where is inner guidance calling you towards anything right now in that regard?
So I've this last year gotten this like, again, it's this like pull that starts getting louder and louder. And it's like I've always been interested in energy work, but didn't know in what way, didn't know where to start. And then just by putting that thought and intention out there and like recognizing, oh, that this is a knowing in me, all of a sudden it's like things start to present themselves. Someone suggests this type of training, or someone hands you a book, or you get into a conversation about dreams, or you get invited to an event. And it's like kind of just like saying yes to it and not
Mhm,
questioning it. Again, with the like, oh, I'm not going to question why this is being presented to me, but if it feels good and my knowing is like yes, then say yes. So Like I started again like this past year getting more into energy work and like what does that look like, and like someone giving me like a tantra book to read, or someone inviting me to this type of
Mhm.
event, or someone suggesting oh reiki training, or someone suggesting doing spiritual coaching with like this woman specifically. And it's like how those show up. And it's like, I didn't
Mhm.
even just go out and research any of this stuff. It's just like, oh, my knowing being like, oh, you're being drawn to this. And then it's presenting itself and saying yes to it.
Mhm. Where do you where does that come from for you? What is that to you?
What do you
That
mean? Where does
sense
what?
where does that sense of inner knowing come from? Or where do you feel like, all of these various synchronicities and opportunities and inclinations, do you feel like that comes from a source of some kind? Some people might say like source itself. But what is that for you?
I know I'm trying to think of like how I describe it. Like when you were asking, I was like imagining something like light pouring in or something. But
Mm,
I guess you'd say like the universe or like spirit guides. Like I feel really like called or like attached to that type of like verbiage, is like, oh, it's like
mhm,
this outward
mm,
external thing that you're connected to that's guiding you through. And it's like, oh, because maybe you've had past lives and like this is
mm,
what your mission is on this life, and this is what you're here to do, and this is how we're going to guide you there. And I really deeply feel that way, of like, oh,
mhm,
there's a while we're like, okay, we're going to be okay with the fact that we don't know the reason why we're pulled to something, doing it anyway, and then finding out why that reason was. So it's like, why am I being more called to energy work? Or why am I being
mhm,
called to certain people or certain events or a certain way to live, really? Like,
mhm,
I was just sharing with someone else, like, the ocean has kind of been like my element, my cleansing, my peaceful place that I would go to most of my life when I wanted a reset. And then 2 years ago, I was living in Boston, like very busy, like loud, and I was like sitting outside in my little tiny patch of grass outside of my apartment, and I was like, I don't belong here. I'm definitely done with living in a city and I need to move to the woods. Like, I need to not see people. I need to live amongst trees and earth. And I know that that's where my next like journey is. And I didn't know how that was going to work. And now 2 years later, I'm in the process of buying a house on like 13 acres with trees all around me, and like exactly what I kind of like felt and
mm,
imagined 2 years ago. And I would never have guessed that like that's where it would end up. But it's just like, oh, you feel like this like source or higher thing is telling
mhm,
you like, okay, now this is the path that you're going on, and you don't need to know why, but you'll figure it out as you get there.
mhm. That's so beautiful. And yeah, again, congratulations on
Thank you.
moving out there and like finding that space. That sounds like absolutely tremendous and nourishing for the soul in so many ways.
For sure.
Hmm.
More like connecting with nature to like tap into that source, tap into that knowing, tap into that energy. Because I noticed that like when I even now when I like visit cities, like I was in New York City a couple weekends ago, and it was like a lot. Like I immediately was like started feeling like frantic almost, and like started feeling a sense of anxiety that I hadn't felt in a long time. And I was like, oh, I think it's like literally the energy of the space that I'm in, either the people or the concrete buildings or the lack of fresh air or the lack of trees and earth. And I was like, this is so interesting to like immediately feel this upon like entering a city.
Mhm. Yeah, I felt the exact same way living in San Francisco, and like the difference in energies versus a city like San Francisco and say like Austin, where nature is
Yeah.
so well integrated into the
Yeah.
city. It's it's night and day, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, it can be so confined and constrained and everything is gridded and measured out.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's not that expansiveness of nature. And I feel like that's what everything is calling us to do, is to like integrate that in our own various ways. And that sounds like it's what you're doing out in
I'm just turning a light on so I don't look like a witch anymore.
honestly, that's probably a really good vibe.
Like, and then we find out Allie's a witch.
Well, and I mean, I'm in some capacities you kind of are, and like whenever you are tuning into like this greater source, like you are really engaging with that side of yourself. And I mean, witches have like, I don't, so many different stories and perspectives on them and culture, but
Right.
it's like that's the part of the woman's soul that is connected to source or to the universe or to God in a very personal and very,
Mm,
strong and empathic way.
yeah.
And so one of the things I'm hearing is that this really helped you. It's not only like the focus of your work right now into expansiveness, but it sounds like you expanded from a less like whenever we make the move into trusting the source or trusting these intuitions, it opens up like a broader trust to everything, and you're not stuck so much in the what could go wrong and
Mm,
a more limited mindset, because that's something that that our ego is constantly watching out for, is like it is there to identify problems and to predict what could go wrong, and it's very good in some ways that it does that, so long as we don't identify with that being how it is.
right.
And so do you have any words of wisdom for people that are really struggling with like either self-limiting beliefs or that are really bound by fear and trusting their source of inner guidance?
That's so interesting, like, of a question, because I grew up kind of in a household where it was always like the go-to was like what could go wrong in this scenario. So that was almost like how I was conditioned, but I
Mm,
didn't agree with it. And I didn't understand that until I got older and started trusting more of like my inner like intuition or just me as a person. And I think a lot of it is connected to confidence within yourself of like, hey, I have this like deep sense of confidence that I've had since as long as I can remember of
mm,
like, I'm strong enough and intelligent enough to be able to figure out any scenario that's put in front of me. And without being like egotistical about it, like obviously I could be thrown into certain scenarios where like someone could be stronger than me physically, or like if it was like a
mm,
safety issue, that's one thing. But when
sure.
you're talking about like everyday life as it is now in like 2022, is I feel that like, oh, I'm confident enough in myself, in my relationships, in my network that I would be able to figure it
Mm,
out. And also having this sense of trust of like, hey, my knowing, my connection to spirit or universe, or even if
mm,
someone wants to call it God, is like, oh, I have these people that like, or like spirits that have my back,
mm,
and they're going to guide me in the right way. And I'll be presented with the right information to handle this scenario should it be like this. But it was interesting, even just like hearing that question is like, I really don't have much. Once in a blue moon, might I be like, oh, this could end up going like not so great or like this, but I rarely ever have that thought, which is really interesting
mm,
because I used to have that thought quite a bit when I was younger.
mm. Beautiful. And where do you feel, it doesn't have to be anything like super concrete or, but what's your current vision for where all of this is leading you? What's the grand vision that you have for what is your purpose? What do you want to see all of this evolve into and blossom into?
I definitely have some again, and yeah, I like that you're like, it doesn't have to be concrete, is like, I love bringing people together and having these types of conversations. I love the idea of like healing together as a community. And I definitely feel really called to, we aren't currently like serving ourselves or the earth the way that we're living. So, like, how can we live differently? And like figuring that out on my own, experiencing that for myself, and then being able to share that with
Mm,
other people. So, like, just a few
mm-hmm,
natural things that I love doing is like bringing people together. I love hosting. I love being in nature and
mm-hmm,
doing some spiritual practices, doing some healing, like talking about stuff that we wouldn't quote like wouldn't be normal within like our regular society of like childhood traumas. What are our triggers in romantic relationships?
mm-hmm,
Stuff like that. So like having deeper conversations in group settings of like, hey, how can we all like heal ourselves and heal each other so that we can also heal the earth? Because like just how we live isn't isn't serving us as a society, as a community, as individual people. It's not serving our future generations or the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So without that being, I guess, that concrete, that's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
what I'm moving towards. And I listen a lot. Like now I'm like, okay, there's a reason that becoming so turned off by
Mm-hmm.
technology. And while I appreciate the positive aspects of, example, Instagram, it keeps the two of us connected. Like we wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
would we have gone connected and have this call otherwise? Probably not. So it's
Right.
really cool that we have that. However, what kind of boundaries do we need that keep it healthy? Because even me, like I start to feel a sense of disconnection happening when I'm on Instagram too long. I start to get this
Mm-hmm.
agitation, these ants under my skin. I start to feel less grounded. I'm not as then connected to my knowing or to source or to spirit
Mm-hmm.
when I'm consumed with technology all around me, or radiation all around me,
Mm-hmm.
or chemicals in food or water, and like we're ingesting that, and a lot of people don't know that, and it's like, how is that actually showing up for you in your life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love what you're saying with regards to like having these conversations and like really like revealing more of like our core central aspects of our humanity to each other, because it can be so difficult to show that in like these everyday like kind of schematic ways, right? Like in the city
Right.
where that happens. And it's I think that the pressures that we see, and like there's so much consciousness being raised around history and around dynamics between different groups of people and our impact on the environment and all of these various things. I think there's so much consciousness being raised there that that's really what we're all trying to do, and none of us has the quote unquote answer to
Right.
how that's going to be, but it's going to the answer is in that conversation between that's taking place between all of us right now. And that's a really beautiful place to be. And it sounds like you know, you're doing that in a very embodied way, or you envision that in an embodied way by sharing with people what has been so instrumental for you, by being in nature, by having deep conversations, by questioning the foundations that we are built upon, and not to like not in any sort of like incompassionate way, but really as a way
Mm,
to bring them into like what is really you. And that's such a beautiful process, and thank you so much for going on the journey and expanding into who
yeah.
you are.
It's almost like a
So,
rebirth, I guess.
mhm,
Like a rebirth of the earth and a rebirth of society.
yeah, which we constantly
Mm,
do, right? As individuals through lifetimes, as individuals within a lifetime. It happens at every stage. You know, we our societies grow up and they relinquish and they flourish again. And yeah, it's just a we're at a really beautiful place, and it can be difficult to see that through all of the conflict and through all of the suffering that is absolutely occurring, and not to know that it's this is where we are. And
mm,
that in and of itself makes it perfect, but not to the sense that we should maintain it, but that it
right.
is where we need to be right now to be where we could be.
Mm, I like that.
Mm. Well, I thank you so much for coming on. Where can people connect with
Yeah,
you?
thank you. I guess Instagram, even though I'm trying to throw my phone out the window, but
What
yeah,
would
you can
your what's
follow
your
me on
handle?
Instagram. It's ALZ Owls 101.
Beautiful. All right, Allie. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and we'll hear from you next time. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.